traditional owners of the land on which we meet and their ancestors, past and present, of the Darug Nation. On behalf of the Organising Committee of the Assyrian Universal Alliance and the Assyrian Australian National Federation, I would like to welcome you all to the official opening of the Assyrian New Year Festival, and I hope you all have an enjoyable afternoon. I would now like to take the opportunity to acknowledge all of our guests that are present here today. The Honourable Tony Abbott, MP, Prime Minister of Commonwealth of Australia, and his wife Margie Abbott, who will be arriving shortly. Reverend Father Nino Salaya, representing His Beatitude Marmila Saya, Metropolitan of the Holy and Apostolic Catholic Assyrian Church of the East, Diocese of Australia, New Zealand and Lebanon. Mr. Hermes Shaheen, Deputy Secretary General of the Assyrian Universal Alliance. Mr. David, President of the Assyrian Australian National Federation. Mr. Simon Sabian, Executive Board Member of the Assyrian Universal Alliance. The Honourable Chris Bowen, MP, Federal Member for McMahon, representing the Honourable Bill Shorten, MP, Leader of the Opposition. Councillor Frank Carboni, Mayor of Fairfield City. Senator the Honourable Concetta Fioravanti Wells, Parliamentary Secretary, officially representing the Honourable Scott Morrison, Minister for Social Services, as well as the Honourable Peter Dutton, MP, Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Mr. Craig Kelly, MP, Federal Member for Hughes. Mr. Chris Hayes, MP, Federal Member for Fowler, Chief Opposition Whip, and Mrs. Bernadette Hayes. The Honourable David Clark, MLC, Parliamentary Secretary for Justice, Deputy Chairman of the Assyria Parliamentary Friendship Group, and Mrs. Marissa Clark. Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile, MLC, President of the Christian Democratic Party, and Mrs. Sylvia Nile. The Honourable Amanda Fazio, MLC, Opposition Whip in the Legislative Council. Mr. Andrew Rohan, MP, Member for Smithfield, Chairman of Assyria Parliamentary Friendship Group, representing the Honourable Mike Baird, MP, Premier of New South Wales. Mr. Guy Zangari, MP, State Member for Fairfield, Shadow Minister for Citizenship and Community, Shadow Minister for Sport and Recreation, Deputy Chairman of Assyria Parliamentary Friendship Group, representing the Honourable Luke Foley, MLC, Leader of the Opposition. Mr. Nick Larledge, MP, Member for Cabramatta. Mr. Hugh McDermott, Labor Candidate for Prospect. Mrs. Maria Depp, new candidate for Cabramatta, and Dr. Thomas Depp, Cabramatta, John Street Medical Centre. Mr. Edward Royal, CDP candidate for Fairfield. Mr. Sam Giwadgas, CDP candidate for Prospect.
We would also like to welcome our guests from the various community groups and organisations. Superintendent Peter Lennon, Fairfield Local Area Commander. Mr. Vias Arapolis, Trade Commissioner, representing Dr. Stavros Kerimidis, Consul General of Greece in Sydney. Ms. Fiona Clark, Assistant Director, New South Wales Settlement Multicultural Affairs, DSS, and Mr. Daniel Valero. Sister Elizabeth Delaney, General Secretary of the National Council of Churches in Australia. Mr. Jeremy Smack, President of the New South Wales George Board of Deputies. Katie Harbour, Community Relations Committee Member. Ms. Linda Ben-Nashi, Community Relations Manager, New South Wales George Board of Deputies. Dr. Ahmed Nasha, President of the Mandaean Australian Community Cultural Club. Mrs. Karen Voss and Mr. Kerry Voss of Christian Faith and Freedom. Mr. Vince Foti, President of Marconi Club. Mr. Frank Oliveri, Director of the Marconi Club. Dr. Peter Tang, President of the Vietnamese Community in Australia and New South Wales Chapter. Dr. David Nguyen, the Vice President of the Vietnamese Community in Australia. Mr. Peter Tangos and Mrs. Monica McHale, representing the Australian Coptic Movement. Mr. Barujan Skandarian, Australian representative of the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Mrs. Skandarian. Mr. George Bellis, President of the Australian Hellenic Council of New South Wales. Mr. Jude Simon, Chief Operations Officer of Violence Fund, and Mrs. Simon. Ms. Susie David, Advisor to the Secretary General of the Assyrian Universal Alliance. Mr. Paul Azzo, Senior Advisor to the Assyrian Universal Alliance Australia and the Assyrian Australian National Federation. Mrs. Carmen Lazar, OAM, People of Australia Ambassador, and Mr. Sargon Lazar. Dr. Paul Burgess, Executive Principal of Presbyterian Ladies College Sydney, Mrs. Susan Burgess, Professor Frank Sumbo from the University of New South Wales, Dr. Imam Sharabi, Australia Day Ambassador, CEO, Immigrant Women's Health Services, and Mr. Heyman Hamo.
Also, we would like to welcome the following councillors: Councillor Joe Maluso and Mrs. Maluso, Councillor George Badicha, Councillor Del Bennett, Councillor Naji Najad, and Councillor Ninos Khoshaba. Delegates from Assyrian organisations present in alphabetical order: Assyrian Australian Association, Assyrian Academic Society, Assyrian Baz Association, Assyrian Charity and Educational Community, Assyrian Democratic Party, Assyrian Patriotic Party, Bednahan Democratic Party, New South Wales Babylon Culture Association, the Populist Chaldean Syriac Assyrian, and the Assyrian Banwet Association.
From our media here today, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson Yonan, SBS Radio, Assyrian Program, Dr. Muwafaq Sawa, Editor-in-Chief, Al-Iraqiya Newspaper, and Mrs. Sawa, Mr. Redmond Zumaya from Nineveh Radio TV and Nineveh TV, Mrs. Widad Farhan and Mr. Bakir Al-Musawi from Panorama Newspaper, Mr. Richard Caulfield and Mrs. Wendy Boynton from ABC TV Media. We'd also like to take this time to welcome our guests that have arrived from overseas. From the homeland, Mr. Emmanuel Khoshaba, Secretary General of the Assyrian Patriotic Party. Also from Iraq, Ms. Jacqueline Zumaya, former member of the Iraqi Parliament and the Chairman of Inanna Women Assembly. And from the USA, Ms. Nahlin Anwiya and Ms. Anna Anwiya, Assyrian activists. Our interstate guests who have arrived here to be with us, Mr. Jacob Howell and Mr. Yaku Yaku, Australian Assyrian Arts and Literature Foundation in Victoria, Mr. and Mrs. Rain Ishak, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Howell, Mr. Khamis Giwadis and Mr. Khamis Giwadis Khamis and Mrs. Khamis.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in welcoming for the very first time at an Assyrian event, the Honourable Tony Abbott, MP, Prime Minister of the